Slayers are an integral part of combat within Hypixel Skyblock, unlocking a wide variety of major profile upgrades in various forms. The most sought after Slayer perk is definitely the Juju Shortbow recipe and requirements, but since I've already covered the Juju Shortbow specifically in a separate video, I'll leave that in the description below instead of covering it a second time. The goal of today's video is to cover the 3 beginner Slayers, since leveling these will not only set you up perfectly to start grinding for the Juju Shortbow requirements, but they will also set you up to perform well in dungeons, progress through the Crimson Isle, and really any other areas of combat that exist within this game. So, with all of that being said, sit back, relax, and enjoy this ultimate beginner's guide to Slayers in Hypixel Skyblock. To get this video started, what actually are Slayers? What defines a Slayer, and how does a player do them? Slayers are an area of Skyblock progression that involves starting quests, and these quests require the player to slay specific mobs, mini-bosses, and bosses. At the time of recording this video, there are 6 different types of Slayers that can be completed, and these are Zombie, Spider, Wolf, Enderman, Blaze, and Vampire Slayer. Each Slayer is referred to with a more sophisticated name on Skyblock, such as the Revenant Horror for Zombie Slayer or the Tarantula Broodfather for Spider Slayer, but people typically refer to them by the type of mob you have to kill for simplicity. As a result, I won't be using each Slayer's proper name much throughout this video, since it's much easier to understand Wolf Slayer rather than Sven Packmaster, for example. Each Slayer has its own unique leveling system that contains plenty of useful recipes, items, and stat buffs, where the first set of perks are unlocked at level 1, and the final perks are unlocked at level 9. The only exception to this as of right now is the Vampire Slayer, which finishes at level 5. The goal of today's video will be to equip you with the necessary gear and knowledge to help you push for level 7 in the first 3 beginner Slayers, which are the Zombie, Spider, and Wolf Slayers respectively. Level 7 in all 3 of these Slayers is often written in the format of 7/7/7, where the first 7 represents Zombie level 7, the second one represents Spider level 7, and the third one represents Wolf Slayer 7. This notation is really important to keep in mind since you'll commonly come across this in the Skyblock community, so if you see me referring to it at all in this video, now you know what it means. Needless to say, I will not be covering Enderman or Blaze Slayer in this video, as they are designed to be tackled at a more mid to late game stage in Skyblock, and I also won't be covering Vampire Slayer since it's substantially different thanks to it being Rift exclusive content. I do have a more mid-game Enderman Slayer guide linked in the description of this video, but if you haven't properly leveled your beginner Slayers yet, then I'd suggest watching this video first before you move on to that one. Starting and completing Slayer quests are actually very simple. In the very early stages, you'll have to locate and talk to Maddox, the Slayer NPC. Maddox is located in the basement of the tavern, or the bar house, which is the house closest to the graveyard along the path heading to the Park Island. Once spoken to, Maddox provides you with a simple GUI that will show you each Slayer's progression system, but if you aren't a high enough level to tackle some of the Slayers, it will instead show the requirement you need to hit first before you can tackle the desired Slayer. Once you've chosen the Slayer that you want to complete, you can start the Slayer quest by clicking on it in Maddox's GUI, and then choosing the difficulty of the boss you'd like to fight. Most Slayers have 4 levels, tier 1, 2, 3, and 4, but some Slayers, such as Zombie and Vampire Slayer, have a final tier 5 difficulty. Slayer bosses get exponentially more difficult the higher the tier, so it's important to be well prepared before tackling the harder bosses. You also need to ensure that you have enough money in your purse to even start the Slayer quest, and the cost of a Slayer quest will vary on the tier, the current elected mayor, and even past community project contributions. Once your quest is started, your scoreboard will update, telling you how many of a specific mob you need to kill before a boss is spawned. If we use tier 1 Zombie Slayer as an example, our scoreboard will tell us that we need to gain 150 combat XP from zombie mobs specifically. This means that if I killed enough graveyard zombies or villager zombies to obtain 150 XP from them, this will spawn a tier 1 Revenant Horror boss. This Revenant Horror marks the end of the Slayer quest, and if successfully defeated, it will grant you some combat XP, coins, and a handful of Slayer specific items. Defeating the boss will also complete the Slayer quest, allowing you to claim some Slayer XP and other rewards when you next speak to Maddox. As you can see, Slayers are a pretty simple concept to understand. This video will equip you with all of the necessary gear and knowledge to tackle tier 1, 2, 3, and 4 zombie, spider, and wolf bosses, as this will be enough to reach level 7 on each of those respective slayers. Progressing past this point is something that will make much more sense to you once you've gained that initial experience, which is why I won't be covering it in this video. I also won't be covering anything that has to do with the RNG system or any of the loot in today's video, as this is fairly complicated and won't actually help you defeat the bosses. Ultimately, if you can successfully farm slayers and get through heaps of quests, eventually you will drop a handful of good items which you can use for your own benefit, or you can sell them for some extra cash. I'll leave links to the Hypixel wiki page in the description of this video if you'd like to read up on this for yourself though, since that'll be the best place to learn about the loot tables and the RNG values. While we're at it, I'd also recommend checking the Hypixel wiki page on any of the slayers that I mentioned in this video, because there is a lot of information to unpack about these slayers, and if I don't cover something in this video, there's a good chance you'll find it on the wiki instead. Lastly, I'm going to talk about two extremely important slayer items. The first is the Maddox Bat Phone, an interactable cell phone item that is unlocked at Wolf Slayer 3. This item is super useful because it lets you remotely call Maddox on any island which a Slayer boss could be spawned and defeated on, removing the need for you to travel to the tavern every single time you want to start or finish a Slayer quest. As you can imagine, this is a major time save and drastically improves your efficiency when grinding Slayer, so it's always recommended to rush the Maddox Bat Phone as soon as you're capable of doing so. The second important Slayer feature is called Auto Slayer. This feature is unlocked when you reach level 6 on 3 of the 6 different Slayers in this game, which for the vast majority of the player base will be when you reach Zombie 6, Spider 6, and Wolf 6. Auto Slayer automatically starts and collects your Slayer quests for you if you've got enough money in your purse or your bank, removing the need for you to speak to Maddox entirely if you're grinding Slayers for an extended period of time. Once again, this further improves efficiency and is a huge quality of life improvement, but it does have a much harder unlock requirement compared to the Maddox Bat Phone. This is a feature you should be trying to unlock once you've got the gear and skill to do so, but the Maddox Bat Phone definitely takes priority here. Needless to say, that covers all the basics regarding Slayers in Hypixel Skyblock. Now that you're kept up to speed, the rest of this video will talk about the bare minimum gear requirements to complete tiers 1 to 4 of the 3 beginner Slayers, as well as the recommended gear that will help you grind them more efficiently. I will also cover the important sections of each of the boss fights and other useful grinding tips to help you get to 777 Slayers as fast as possible. So, without further ado, let's talk about gear requirements. To start off the gear requirements, I'm first going to cover general gear recommendations that will apply to all of the Slayers in this game. These items are typically seen as support items in one way or another, and while they may not help you literally deal damage to the bosses, they will definitely help with survivability and they'll make the process a lot smoother. As a result, the first item I'd like to talk about in this video is the God Potion. The God Potion, or God Pot for short, is the strongest buff potion in Hypixel Skyblock, granting the highest tier of almost every positive status effect in the game. This potion lasts for 12 hours at a base level, but it can be increased up to a 28-hour duration if you max out the alchemy skill and if you have a level 100 legendary parrot pet in your pets menu. Despite this, it's still worth consuming a God Pot even if your alchemy is 0 and it only lasts 12 hours, because it massively buffs your raw damage, crit chance, mobility, survivability, and even your grinding efficiency. The one downside to this potion is that it can be very expensive for newer players to maintain, but once you're able to do so comfortably, you will never play this game ever again without the God Pot buff. Similar to the God Pot, we've got Booster Cookies. Booster Cookies are mostly useful for completing Slayers because of their increased magic find and the combat wisdom they provide, but the other quality of life perks will also make a regular appearance when grinding Slayers. That being said, Booster Cookies are extremely expensive, often being around 5 times more expensive than a God Pot. I totally understand if you're watching this video and unable to regularly afford Booster Cookies, so if it isn't something that you can regularly purchase, don't worry about it too much. It's definitely worth noting and keeping in mind for whenever you can afford them though, which is why I've made sure to include them on this list. Straying away from consumables now, we've got our first support weapons. These are the Zombie Sword, Ornate Zombie Sword, and Florid Zombie Sword, which are all direct upgrades to one another with varying requirements. These weapons instantly heal the player a certain amount of health when right-clicking with the sword, which, as you can imagine, is extremely useful when fighting a Slayer boss that can chunk away at your health very quickly. I always recommend the zombie swords to newer players that are trying Slayer bosses for the first time, because these will help you keep your health in check before you know what you're doing and are able to consistently tackle the boss. The zombie sword you should be using depends entirely on the one that you can afford and use, so if you're able to use the best one, which is the Florid zombie sword, then I'd absolutely recommend going for that. Similar to the zombie swords, the healing ones are another extremely useful healing item. These come as the Wand of Healing, Mending, Restoration, and Atonement, which funnily enough, all have varying zombie slayer requirements that get more difficult to obtain the stronger the wand. Unlike the zombie swords, the healing ones provide steady and consistent healing over a long period of time, which is also very useful in ensuring that your health stays high and doesn't drop to scarily low numbers. The only downsides to these ones is that you actually have to progress with Zombie Slayer before you can use these anywhere else, so I guess now you've got the motivation to work towards Zombie 7 for that Wand of Atonement. The next support item I'm going to cover are deployables, but more specifically, power orbs. Blaze Slayer does have its own set of deployables called flares, but even the most basic of flares are way too difficult to obtain and also quite expensive, so it's not exactly fitting for an early game guide. As a result, I'm going to recommend the Radiant Orb, Mana Flux, and even the Overflux Power Orb, which are the deployables that are obtained from Wolf Slayer. These items can be placed to provide you with some solid buffs as long as you're within the range of the placed orb, allowing you to place it down once a boss has spawned to gain that constant buff throughout the fight. These buffs don't just consist of solid healing buffs though, because once you upgrade into a Mana Flux, you start to see a minor damage buff and even a mana regeneration buff. Once again, the only downside to these is that they're locked behind different Wolf Slayer levels, so you will have to progress with Wolf Slayer before you unlock them. The next support item that I highly recommend is the Endstone Sword. This weapon is completely slept on in the Hypixel community, despite it having some immense potential, especially against Slayers. This is because its ability converts all of your mana into a supercharged hit, which deals boosted damage depending on how much mana you've consumed. However, this isn't the reason that it's so strong though. It's the fact that it also grants you 50% damage reduction when you've consumed all of your mana, and that damage reduction is applied over a 5-second period. This allows you to absorb significantly more damage than you originally could, meaning that if you time your abilities correctly against specific bosses, you'll see little to no damage taken even when the boss is at its strongest point. Furthermore, it's also dirt cheap and the collection is super easy to unlock by node mining in the end, so you really have no excuse to not have one, even as an Iron Man player. The healing helmets are the first and only armor pieces I'll recommend in this section, and these come in the form of the Zombie's Heart, Crystallized Heart, Revived Heart, and Reaper Mask. The main thing about these helmets is that they double your mending and vitality stats when worn, which provides a tremendous boost to your health regen. That being said, these helmets not only prevent you from using a damaging helmet in the helmet slot, but they also have Zombie Slayer requirements similar to the healing ones. As a result, I don't often recommend these unless your setup works really well with them and you're struggling heavily with survivability. If you can avoid it, you should just stick to using the healing ones and zombie swords as your main sources of boosted healing. And lastly, I just want to throw out a handful of miscellaneous support items that may make a difference depending on the Slayer you're doing and your stats. These are the Weird Tuber, Weirder Tuber, Ragnarok Axe, Sword of Bad Health, and even the Edible Mace. I'm not going to explain what they're for, how to get them, or whether you should even use these or not, because these items are much more situational and in many cases, they're typically seen as overkill. As a result, most beginner players just getting started with Slayers are not ever going to need these, but if you wish to read up on them to learn about other ways you can improve your gameplay, feel free to check them out on the Hypixel Wiki, which I've left a link to in the description below. However, now that we've covered all of these items, I'm going to move on to the gear recommendations for Tier 1 Zombie, Spider, and Wolf Slayer. Gear requirements for Tier 1 Zombie, Spider, and Wolf Slayer are actually very simple. These bosses are designed to be defeated with next to nothing at all, so you can practically get away with anything for your first ever completion. That being said, there are still some basic weapons and armor that I would recommend, which you can follow if it makes things easier. For your weapon, you'll want to use any very early game weapon that you can afford. This can be as basic as an undead sword or the fancy sword you can buy from the Gold Forger, or it could be something a little bit stronger like an Aspect of the End. Regardless of what you pick, make sure that it's reforged and enchanted as best as you can afford, so you have an easier time killing the boss. If you're looking for more weapon recommendations in general, I'd highly suggest checking out my weapon progression guide, which I've also left a link to in the description. Armor for Tier 1 Slayer is also just any very early game set that you can afford. Even the basic starter gear from Rosetta should do the trick, but if you want something stronger that will actually last you, you can go with Lapis Armor or even Ender Armor. If you do opt to use Ender Armor, I'd strongly suggest pairing it with a Void Sword because this will deal excellent damage to anything you fight because of how the armor set bonus works. Pets for Tier 1 bosses is also just any very early game pet that you can afford, such as a rare or epic Enderman pet, a common or uncommon Griffin, or even a rare lion or tiger pet. You can honestly even get away with using no pet at all for Tier 1 bosses, but this isn't a good habit to get into for Tier 2 and above. Depending on the pet that you have, giving it a Dwarf Turtle Shellmet to equip will also be very beneficial when fighting the boss, because this will prevent you from taking all knockback. That being said, if the Shellmet item is much more expensive than the cost of the pet, hold off from buying one for now and use it on a more expensive pet later down the line. Equipment for Tier 1 bosses isn't really all that necessary, but if you want something to fill the slots, go with the basic Ender equipment. This also gives you more of a reason to push for the full Ender Armor set and Void Sword, because all of these items together work to buff your damage and provide a killer early game setup. Magical power requirements for Tier 1s are also next to nothing, since your armor, weapon, and pet choices will be good enough for the time being. Despite this, pushing for as much magical power as possible is always recommended no matter what stage of the game you're at, because this will provide extremely useful for anything combat related moving forward. Using the default Warrior Power Stone will also be your best bet, since it's free and will provide the best melee damage. If everything that I just said has made no sense to you and you've got no idea what a talisman or magical power is, I do have a full talisman and magical power guide linked in the description of this video, so check that out if you need more information about that. Either way, that wraps up the only gear that you'll really need to reliably take out Tier 1 bosses. Frankly, you should only have to complete one Tier 1 boss anyways, because the loot and XP gained from them are so insignificant that it's just not worth farming. As a result, let's cover recommended gear for Tier 2 bosses, because this is where Slayers actually start to become challenging and will require some decent equipment. Gear requirements for Tier 2 bosses are still fairly simple, but will definitely matter a lot more to your success when defeating Slayers. Weapon choices for Tier 2s will be an aspect of the end at the very least, but by this stage, you'll definitely want to be using a Void Sword with the full Ender Armor setup. Alternatively, you could jump straight to an aspect of the dragons if you'd like to fork out the million coins right now, but it's not necessary for just Tier 2 bosses. This weapon will come in handy for Tier 3 and Tier 4s though, so there's no harm in buying one now if you want to. Armor options would be Ender Armor at the bare minimum, especially if you're using Ender equipment and a Void Sword. However, if you have a little bit more money to spend, using full unstable or strong dragon armor will make it much easier to take out these bosses, especially if you made that jump to the aspect of the dragons. Pet choices don't have to change drastically from Tier 1 bosses, as the benefits that cheaper pets provide are all relatively similar, and this won't change unless you spend significantly more money. I don't have a pet progression guide at the time of recording this video just yet, but I have made comprehensive pet comparison videos that I'll leave linked in the description of this video. To summarize, keeping a rare or epic Enderman, a common or uncommon Griffin, and a rare lion or rare tiger will still work great, so don't bother changing these unless you really wanted to. Similar to Tier 1s, equipment isn't really all that necessary for Tier 2s. If you don't have any equipment, then going for the Ender set will suffice, but spending any more time or money on stronger pieces won't be worthwhile for the difference they make. As for your talismans, you'll want to have something in your accessory bag at the very least, and if I had to give a recommendation of any sort, it would be around 150 magical power. You can continue to use the Warrior Power Stone if you don't want to upgrade, but shooting for Bloody or Silky once you unlock the requirements will make a noticeable change to your damage. Once again, if this still sounds completely insane and you have no idea what I'm talking about, do check out the talisman video that I have in the description of this video, because it covers all of this stuff in far more detail. That being said, that concludes some possible gear options for all the Tier 2 bosses that I'll be covering in this video. Tier 3s are when the real challenge starts to happen though, so let's cover some recommended gear requirements for Tier 3 bosses. For Tier 3 bosses, you'll really want to start looking into using an aspect of the dragons at the bare minimum as your weapon of choice. The AOTD is easily the cheapest but most effective weapon you can use to complete both Tier 3 and Tier 4 bosses. The Livid Dagger is a very close competitor to the AOTD, mostly due to it having 50% base attack speed, but from past videos where I've tested it against the AOTD, it doesn't appear to actually make much of a DPS difference. I'll leave a link to my testing videos in the description if you'd like to learn more, but if you've already got a Livid Dagger for whatever reason, you don't have to sell it and then buy an AOTD in replacement. If you're still using a Void Sword or an AOTE from the previous bosses though, this is where I would recommend upgrading into an AOTD. At this stage, you'll also want to be using unstable or strong dragon armor at the bare minimum, because ender armor isn't going to cut it for most people. If you've got extra money laying around, full superior dragon armor will work exceptionally well, but this is really pricey and a huge jump from unstable or strong dragon. The classic 3/4 mixed Shadow Assassin set is also a viable option for tier 3s, but this does require you to have some dungeon experience thanks to its requirements, so I don't suggest going out of your way just to get this set, and you should only be using it if you've already got one. I will also leave some armor comparison videos in the description of this video if you wish to see how these sets perform against each other. Tier 3s are where you'll also want to start thinking about possible pet upgrades, or at the very least, giving your pet the Dwarf Turtle Shelmet pet item so you don't take knockback mid-fight. This will make the boss fights much easier and will be a worthwhile upgrade at this stage. Quick pet recommendations at this level are the Legendary Wither Skeleton, Epic Megalodon pet, Epic Lion or Epic Tiger pet, and whatever you decide to go with will depend on your budget and your preferences. Once again, I highly suggest checking out my big pet comparison videos for more details, because these test all your favorite pets in much more extensive detail and will help you make the right decision. At this stage, your armor, weapon, and pet choices will be strong enough gear upgrades to complete tier 3s, but if you insist on upgrading your equipment, there are a few options. If you're using the aspect of the dragons, upgrading into a Dragon-Fused Glove will be extremely beneficial, since the damage buff it provides is very significant, and it actually makes the AOTD completely outperform the Livid Dagger. The Rift Necklace is also a great necklace upgrade once you've started progressing through the Rift, and I'd highly suggest using it if you've progressed through the Rift. As for your cloak and belt, there aren't really any smaller upgrades like the Rift Necklace or Dragon-Fused Glove, so keeping some ender pieces will still work fine. That being said, if you've got the requirements, using a Shadow Assassin cloak or adaptive belt will work really well, but these require Catacombs experience and aren't necessary for tier 3s. Alternatively, you also could be using an Implosion belt or any of the Molten pieces, but you have to be Combat 22 to use these at all, and they're also a bit expensive for what you get. Lastly, magical power upgrades are highly recommended for tier 3s, as this is where a large bulk of your damage will come from. At this stage, I'd strongly encourage you to be pushing for 250 magical power at minimum, but shooting for over 300 should be your goal. The Bloody and Silky Power Stones are highly recommended as well, and the one that works best for you will just depend on the exact stats you have. Your goal with the Power Stone you choose should be to try and balance your strength and crit damage to be as close to a 1-to-1 ratio, as this will maximize your damage as best as possible. And with that being said, that covers some solid tier 3 boss setups to help you with the 3 beginner slayers. Alongside these gear upgrades, you should also be trying to work on your skills and your skyblock level, because these will help beef up your profile stats a lot more, and this will make a big difference when doing slayers. Skyblock level in particular has a big influence on your total EHP, and leveling it is as simple as upgrading your minion slots, unlocking simple collections, and even just leveling your skills. That being said, now it's time to cover the last setups that will help you take out tier 4s to help you push for that big 777 goal. Using an aspect of the dragons will be more than enough to take out tier 4s, assuming that you upgrade other areas of your profile as well. However, if you really want to upgrade out of the AOTD, then I'd suggest either the Bouquet of Lies, Fellthorn Reaper, or even a Shadow Fury. These are significantly more expensive weapon upgrades that all have their own dungeon requirements though, and I'd strongly advise against this unless you absolutely want to, or if you'd get other value out of these weapons as well. Once again, if you'd like to see how these weapons fare up against each other, I will leave a weapon comparison video in the description of this video, because I have tested these in the past, and that video should help you make your own judgment to see if you should even go for them. Tier 4s will definitely require an armor change, and the best one by far has got to be the Superior Dragon set. It's definitely possible to get away with the 3/4 mixed Shadow Assassin set in some situations, but Superior not only does more damage, but it also grants you bonus magic find, attack speed, and other miscellaneous stats that will help with all slayers. Alternatively, you could use a 3/4 Shadow Assassin set with a Tarantula helmet if you've got the dungeon requirements, but this set has noticeably less EHP than Superior for only a slight damage increase. Once again, I'd recommend checking out my armor comparison guides for more details on these sets, as I will not be covering them in depth today. Pet choices for tier 4s are pretty much the same as tier 3s, but upgrading into even stronger upgrades is worth it if you want to spend that extra time or money. Keeping a legendary Wither Skeleton or epic Megalodon, Lion, or Tiger should still suffice, but a legendary Lion pet would provide a noticeable damage and DPS increase that will carry on much later into other areas of combat. This pet is quite pricey compared to the other recommendations though, so if you don't want to fork out that money just yet, you don't have to. Equipment options are surprisingly still not that important, even for tier 4 Slayers. That being said, it would be strange to not be using the Rift Necklace and Dragonfuse Glove at the very least, with the ender pieces from before. However, if you've experimented with dungeons and met a handful of the requirements, swapping to the classic Bone Necklace, Shadow Assassin Cloak, Adaptive Belt, and Soulweaver Gloves combo will be the last equipment set that you'll need until the very late game. As a result, whenever you do get these requirements, I strongly suggest upgrading into them as soon as possible, because this is a very good set of equipment and it will work both for Slayers and for dungeons and literally anything else in this game. And then for your magical power, this is where you should absolutely have a minimum of 350. Personally, I'd shoot for 500 magical power, as this isn't super unreasonable to achieve, but it's so overkill that it will make every Slayer really easy for a long while. Not only will it make the beginner Slayers a walk in the park, but it will set you up very well for Enderman Slayer, which is likely the progression pathway you'll want to follow after you've reached 777. Power Stones will stay the same with Silky or Bloody, but you could consider using Itchy if you want to experiment with attack speed, or even upgrading into Hurtful if you have a lot of money. Hurtful is extremely expensive though, so it makes sense to skip this for now if you're not willing to spend that money yet. And with those final gear recommendations out of the way, that covers a wide range of different gear progressions that you can go for on your early game Slayer grind. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which gear upgrades you pick, as long as they're strong enough to accomplish the goals you're shooting for. The recommendations I've made in this video will provide a solid benchmark for you to comfortably beat Slayers with minimal issues, but working on other profile stats and getting general combat experience will matter significantly more than what weapon or armor set you've chosen. As a result, the next few segments of this video will provide some general tips that you can apply to your gameplay, so you know what to expect when it comes to fighting these bosses. To start off the boss tips section of this video, I'll first cover Zombie Slayer and some important things that you should look out for. For starters, Zombie Slayer is most commonly spawned with the crypt ghouls found in the crypts of the graveyard. You can also find golden ghouls in specific spots in these crypts, and these mobs will give you slightly more XP than the standard crypt ghouls. That being said, it is also possible to spawn a Revenant horror boss with a wide range of other mobs you likely wouldn't expect, such as a Sea Walker, Rider of the Deep, or even a Water Hydra, which you can catch from fishing, and even the Minos Hunters from the Mythological Ritual event can also spawn the Revenant horror boss. Once the boss has spawned, there's really only one major mechanic you need to look out for when you are fighting it. Tier 3 and Tier 4 bosses have an ability called Enrage, where after the boss has been alive for 40 seconds, the boss's armor will change color and he'll visibly look a lot more intimidating. This enraged state lasts for 12 seconds and it increases the boss's damage from 25% to 500%, and his attack range is also buffed by 50%. Usually, this will never be an issue since the goal is to take the boss out before it even enrages at all, but if your setup is too weak and you find yourself in this situation, the best thing you can do is to run away from the boss for 12 seconds and go back to fighting it after it returns to its normal state. Revenant horror bosses also have a life drain and pestilence ability, which you'll find when fighting tier 1 and tier 2 bosses respectively. Life Drain, which is the tier 1 boss ability, drains a little bit of your health every 2.5 seconds, and then Pestilence, which is found with tier 2 and above bosses, deals 25% AoE damage within an 8.5 block range. I wouldn't really worry about these attacks though, because neither of them really do much to the player, assuming that you've prepared well enough and you can handle the boss effectively. All in all, this boss in all 4 of its tiers is really simple, with the only major differences being a massive health and massive damage increase. As a result, as long as you can upgrade your gear and stats accordingly to accommodate for this, you'll be completely fine when shooting for Zombie Slayer 7. Moving on to Spider Slayer, this Slayer is arguably the easiest one and should cause you the least amount of troubles. The optimal spawning locations for Tarantula Slayer is with the various types of spiders in the Spider's Den, but if you're absurdly overgeared, the flaming spiders in the Burning Desert on the Crimson Isles are technically the fastest. These spiders have 1 million health each though, so definitely stay away from them if you're not in the late game. As for the Tarantula Broodfather itself, this boss is a complete joke. It only has 2 abilities for tiers 2, 3, and 4, which involve this pounce attack where it attempts to jump onto the player, and an AoE ability that deals damage every second and reduces your healing by 50%. Tier 1s don't even have that AoE ability at all, so really all you have to be careful for is the supposed combat jump, which funnily enough never seems to really trigger and also doesn't do much damage. The only thing to watch out for with Tarantula Slayer is the increasingly buffed health and damage that each tier receives, so as long as you're appropriately geared for the boss, it's really just a matter of sitting up against a wall and bashing it until it's defeated. And now we can move on to Wolf Slayer, arguably the hardest Slayer of the bunch. The optimal location to spawn the Sven Packmaster is in a place called the Howling Cave, which can be found by heading to the waterfall in the Birch Park and using a Super Boom TNT to open the cracked wall. Alternatively, MVP Plus players can use the travel scroll that teleports them to the Howling Cave, removing the need to have to super boom the wall every time. However, this spot is quite popular and tends to have a lot of people all trying to spawn their bosses as well, so it's usually more efficient to farm Wolf Slayer on the hub island at the castle. This is because ranked players can get private hub lobbies by just talking to the hub selector NPC, but even if you don't have a rank, it's still really easy to find uncontested castle lobbies by just going through the hub selector NPC and picking through the mega lobbies that don't have many players in them. That being said, the main difficulty with the Sven Packmaster boss happens at tier 2 and above. This is because the boss deals true damage instead of regular damage, meaning that all of its attacks ignore your defense completely, and as a result, will cause you to take substantially more damage. This can pose quite a challenge for newer players since a lot of people rely on their health and defense to help with survivability. Additionally, tier 3 and 4 bosses have a second phase that activates when you get the boss to half health. At half HP, the Sven Packmaster will call in a bunch of small wolf pups to fight alongside it, and if you weren't expecting this or don't know how to deal with the pups, they can easily shred your health and cause you to lose the fight. As a result, I'll quickly provide you some useful tips to keep note of when you begin to farm this boss for yourself. To deal with the true damage problem, you'll want to ensure that your gear provides enough base health and isn't strictly defense oriented. All of the gear recommendations for tier 3 and 4 in this video should work completely fine to do this, but if you're really desperate, you could opt to use Mastiff armor, which is the Wolf Slayer armor unlocked at Wolf Slayer 4. Additionally, putting true protection on your chestplate is worthwhile for that extra true defense. However, if you are going to do this, I'd only suggest applying it to a superior dragon chestplate or a shadow assassin one, because it's a bit of a waste to apply it on any of the cheaper armor sets. That being said, a really effective counter to the true damage problem is to just work on your overall profile stats to increase your skyblock level, because increasing your base HP instead of relying on armor and enchants will provide you the most success when fighting this boss. People tend to ignore skyblock levels far more than they actually should, so if you don't mind taking a break from Wolf Slayer for a bit, leveling your skyblock level a bunch and then coming back to the Slayer will be beneficial. As for dealing with the pups for tier 3 and 4 bosses, I highly recommend that you fight your first few bosses in a nearby water source. The castle has 2 small water ponds in which you can do this easily, and the Howling Cave also has one that you can use. Spawning the boss and luring it into the water will cause it to move extremely slowly, which will let you comfortably hit it without having to take too much damage yourself. Be very careful when doing this though, because if you don't take any damage from the boss for too long, it'll regenerate back to full health since the game thinks that you're trying to cheese it in some way. To counter this, get close to the boss every few seconds or so that it can hit you at least once, and while you regenerate your health, keep your distance in the water. The water will also slow the pups down and cause them to drown, which makes the boss much easier to deal with. Eventually, you can work your way to spawning bosses without the help of a water source, but this is a very good strategy when you're starting out. But with all that being said, that essentially covers all the major points that I had for this video. Hopefully you found this guide useful, enjoyable, or informative in some way, and if you did, be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. For those of you that made it to the end of this video, I'd also like to end things off with a final point of advice, and that's simply just to practice. Having the right gear and profile stats for each Slayer will certainly make a huge difference, but the other half of the battle is all that combat experience and practice that you gain from actually getting out there and beating these Slayers. For most people, it will take a few attempts before you start to see some success, so the best thing that I can recommend to you is to keep trying and keep perfecting your strategy until it starts to work. Either way, that is everything that I have for you today, and I wish you the best of luck with your early game Slayer grind.